Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I would like to give you part 2 of the Chaos Space Marine faction focus. Originally I stated this would be the final part of the faction focus, but after trying to edit the monstrosity that was the original part 2, it was over an hour and a half long. I have decided to break down the faction focus into even more parts. At the rate I was going, I wouldn't be able to upload the original part 2 until late this week. And if I followed that same path for future faction focuses, then that means I'd be releasing one video close to every 2 weeks, which is not sustainable for the channel. So instead of ruining my channel by taking too much time on longer videos that have more information, I have decided I'm going to release videos much more frequently that are much shorter. So this part 2 is going to be part 2 of many. I can't say how many parts that I'm going to have in total because, to be honest, I don't know how many parts there will be at this point, but I'm going to make videos that are around 10 to 20 minutes long like my normal videos, and I will try to fit as much information as I can in each video. And with this format, I can go back to releasing 2 to 3 videos a week. So with that explanation out of the way, let's get into the content of this video, which is going to be the Legion traits that CSM has to offer and how I would best make use of those traits, and also which traits I think are the best suited for competitive play. With that said, I'm not saying you should only play the Legions that I think are the best. I'm just saying that if you have competitive as your main goal and if you would like to win tournaments, then going for the most efficient options are always the best options. Anyways, with that said, let's get into all of the Legion traits and how to make best use of them, and then I will go over which of the traits I think are the best for competitive play when considering everything the army has to offer. So there are 8 sub-factions in the Chaos Space Marine Codex, and I will cover them in the order they appear in the book, so if you'd like, you can follow along with your codex. Black Legion. The Black Legion trait is that their leadership is increased by 1, meaning this Legion has the best leadership of all the vanilla Chaos Space Marines. But this trait also has another rule included, which is that if a Black Legion infantry, dreadnought, or biker advances, then their rapid-fire weapons become assault. Meaning if you have a rapid-fire 1 gun like a bolter, then that bolter becomes assault 1 if you advance with it. This means the Legion can advance and still shoot their rapid-fire weapons, although it will suffer the -1 to hit penalty, as all assault weapons do when a unit advances and goes to try to shoot. This trait is really good in builds that focus on a lot of rapid-fire weaponry units, advancing up the board to close the gap for some charges later on. The units that make the best use of this trait would be Chaos Cultists because of their autoguns, Chaos Space Marines because of their bolters, and Chaos Space Marine Bikers because of their twin bolters. Because of this, this army makes a great Deathbile style army where you have a blob of Cultists and Chaos Space Marines leading some great characters in the close combat pretty quickly since they are advancing every turn. I will get more into specific strategies later once I start talking about individual units, but essentially this army is really good at getting in close, shooting while they're getting in close, and they do it faster than any other Legion because they can advance while still shooting. Sure, it takes away a little bit of the damage that you would get from just normally moving and shooting, but still a little bit of damage is better than none, and mobility is key in this game. So if you want to get on objectives, if you want to be able to get board control and push your opponent back into their deployment zone, then you're going to want to be moving up the board as quick as possible. And with this Legion, this is the best Legion to do that with. Iron Warriors. The Iron Warriors trait is that their ranged weapons ignore cover benefits for the opponent, and also they can reroll failed wounds against buildings. This trait is great in certain situations, but isn't very good overall in my opinion. Against armies that like setting up a gunline parking lot in a ruin, you can ignore the fact that they are in that cover when it comes to their cover saves, which is pretty nice. And against units that have an ability that gives them +2 or more for being in cover, that gets ignored as well, making it easy to kill stuff like sniper scouts from Imperium armies. The second part of the trait, which gives rerolls to failed wound rolls against buildings, well, that's not very useful at all in competitive play, because maybe 1 out of every 100 people actually bring a fortification in their list, meaning the chances of this part of the trait being useful is very slim. Personally, I feel that this trait is one of the weaker ones in the Codex just because it relies a lot on your opponent's army being built and played a certain way. And if you go up against lists that aren't built or played that way, then this army-wide Legion trait is pretty much useless or very close to useless. Personally, if I was playing an Iron Warriors army, I would not build my army around this trait. Unlike the Black Legion trait, which I spoke of earlier, I would definitely build an army around that trait. But for Iron Warriors, I would instead build the army around other things like Warlord traits or even relics that they have to offer. But I will get that into another future part of this faction focus. Renegade Chapters. This really isn't a legion and was just put into the book in case you wanted to play a custom chapter or warband, but most people who make a custom chapter or warband just use rules for one of the real chapters or legions, which is perfectly okay. If you do end up going with this legion though, your infantry, bikers, hellbrutes, and demon princes can still advance and still charge, which is actually pretty good. The main downside to this though is that the Renegade Chapter units cannot use Veterans of the Long War, which is one of the best stratagems in the book. To make the best use of this trait, you can ally in a Supreme Command detachment of 3 Demon Princes who can't make use of Veterans of the Long War anyways, and this allows them to all advance and charge, which is really nice. Also, for those of you who are commenting saying that Demon Princes don't get Legion traits because it doesn't say that in the Codex, Games Workshop has FAQ'd it to allow Demon Princes to also be included in the units that get access to the Legion traits. So personally, I think this trait is the best on Demon Princes because they can make the best use out of it, but this trait is also pretty useful on any melee unit that is going to be advancing up the board to get into combat. But to be honest, other traits do the job better and have better options, like being able to use Veterans of the Long War. World Eaters. World Eaters are one of the more popular Chaos Legions, being the main Legion of Khorne. Their Legion trait is +1 attack in the turn that you charged. This is pretty straightforward and pretty good, although I wish it was updated so that it was when you charge, get charged, or heroically intervene. But for now, it's only when you charge. Units that benefit the most from this trait are Chaos Cultists, Demon Princes, Chaos Lords, basically anyone who wants to get up in the enemy's face and stab them. This trait is also amazing on Berserkers. They already have a bunch of attacks, but this gives them even more to just make sure that you delete the unit that you get in contact with. But with that said, this can also be a double-edged sword, because if you delete the unit you come in contact with, then you can't really surround a unit and take a hostage to keep your unit from being shot at on the next turn. So with that said, this trait also has the downside because you will most likely murder the unit you get in close combat with, which will leave your unit out in the open to be shot at. So you have to be very careful on how you use this, what you charge it with, and try to plan out being able to at least tag something else after you kill the unit that you charge. Night Lords. The Night Lord's trait is a -1 to leadership to enemy units within 6 inches of one of your units, and it can be stacked to a -3 leadership. This sounds amazing in theory, but in practice actually isn't that great when you consider that a lot of armies that use big units have ways to make their squads morale immune, like Orcs and Tyranids. Also, every army in the game has access to the Insane Bravery stratagem, which can also negate this pretty hard. On top of that, when you're close enough to the enemy to get this trait off, you don't want to gamble on a leadership check, and instead, you might want to just kill your opponent outright. Or if you're trying to charge in and trying to take a hostage to keep your unit safe, and if you don't know what I mean by taking a hostage, I mean after you're done your attacks, you consolidate around one little model so he can't leave combat, therefore your unit can't be shot at, and then on your opponent's turn, in their fight phase, you murder that unit, and now on your turn, you're allowed to walk around, charge, shoot, and do whatever you want without being shot at on your opponent's turn. You can't really do this with this trait because that leadership modifier might actually make that model run away, which will leave your unit out in the open ready to be shot at. So overall, I think this is one of the better looking traits that melee units can make use of, but it just doesn't work with the way that the game is currently designed. Emperor's Children. This trait allows your units to always fight first in the fight phase. Originally in my older video titled Which Chaos Space Marine Legion is the Best, I originally didn't think this trait was that good. But after a lot of thinking and more experience against similar rules from other armies, I think this trait is actually really good, especially when you're up against a melee-centric army, because the army basically gets to use the interrupt stratagem that costs 2 command points for free multiple times in a turn, which is an insane value. The best unit to make use of this trait are any melee units. Sure, shooting units can somewhat benefit from it as well, but if your shooting unit is tied up in close combat, then you're probably in a bad spot to begin with. So this trait is pretty good, and you can kind of build a list around it, but it's only necessarily really good when you're up against melee-centric armies. So this does mean that it's very situational. If you're against an opponent that has a pure shooting army, then this trait is still okay, but I mean it's not as good as some of the other traits that you might be able to take if you wanted to play a different legion. Alpha Legion. This trait makes all of your infantry, hellbrutes, spikes, and demon princes -1 to hit from ranged weapons shooting from over 12 inches away. This is amazing for your screening units like cultists or tactical marines, and it's great for shooting units like Daka Brutes or Havocs. It also works on bikes, so if you like bikes then you can make use of it, but more often than not it's kind of moot on bikes because the bikes want to zoom up and get within 12 inches to rapid fire their twin bolters, but then that means they will be close enough to the enemy that they won't get the -1. So keep that in mind while trying to utilize this trait on bikes. Havocs and Daka Brutes make good use of this though because they normally want to stand still and shoot from across the board, so it fits them perfectly. -1 to hit is one of the better traits in the game in my opinion because it's a good soft counter to shooting armies, which take up the majority of armies in the game. So overall, I think this trait is definitely good enough to build an army around. You can make a stationary Alpha Legion gun line, which is actually really good, and it was how I originally played my Chaos Space Marines a few months ago. You can also use this on a battalion of like cultists or something so that it's hard to kill your screen and they can deliver good units into combat like Demon Princes, Chaos Lords, and stuff like that if you wanted to go the Deathball style route. So overall, I think this trait is one of the best in the Codex and it's definitely worth building an army around. Word Bearers. Word Bearers can re-roll their failed morale tests. So their trait is basically what all Imperial Space Marines get for free with the rule, and they shall know no fear. So although this trait is somewhat helpful, it's what I would say is the most useless trait out of all the Legion traits. With that said though, you could still make a pretty decent Word Bearers list. Combined with their Warlord trait that I will be talking about in a future video, you could actually make a pretty decent gun line out of these guys. Although again, I would say that the gun line is better reserved for Alpha Legion armies if you want to go that route. But you can end up making big squads that get to re-roll their morale, so you can bring big squads of like Chaos Space Marines, big squads of Berserkers, big squads of a ton of stuff, and you can still make use of this Legion trait. But overall though, it really doesn't give all that much, so I wouldn't necessarily build a list based around this, although you could keep it in mind while building your list so you can afford to bring bigger squads. But again, overall, I just think every other Legion has something better to offer. So now that I've mentioned what each Legion trait does, let me quickly give you my top 3 of which Legion traits I think are the best to build a list around that can do well in competitive. Number 1, Alpha Legion. I think Alpha Legion is the best trait by far, and if you're going based off of traits alone, then I would definitely put them at number 1. But with that said, when you consider all of the available units, relics, and stratagems that each army has to offer, I would say Alpha Legion is actually number 2. And instead, if you were considering all of that, I would put Black Legion at number 1. I think the Black Legion trait is great for competitive because it allows you to get some really good board control through pretty mobile infantry like cultists or tactical marines. Advancing and being able to shoot is pretty good for board control since you're sacrificing only a tiny bit of damage for more mobility, which I think is a great trade-off since board control is one of the more important aspects of winning a competitive game of Warhammer 40k. And I think the third best trait would be World Eaters. I think World Eaters trait is great on some of the more competitive units like cultists and Demon Princes, and when considering their stratagems and relics, I think World Eaters fit into being the third best competitive Legion overall from the Chaos Space Marine Codex. And that's going to be it for this video. Like I said earlier, I'm going to be making multiple short videos for this faction focus instead of a couple longer videos because it better suits my channel. So with that said, I hope that you guys are okay with that and still looking forward to the future parts. At least those parts are going to be coming out more frequently instead of having to wait 1 or 2 weeks for the giant part. But anyways, before I end this video, I'd like to mention to check me out on Patreon. Patreon allows me to continue making videos full-time alongside my ad revenue from YouTube. I also help my patrons with stuff like basic coaching and even list building. So if you want to help support the channel to allow me to continue making videos full-time, then the best way is to check me out on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Also, don't forget to check out the channel sponsor, themagnetbaron.com. They offer magnets of all sizes, magnetized movement trays, magnetized flight stands, and they even offer fully built and magnetized models, all for a great price. So if you're looking at picking up magnets for your hobbying needs, then check out themagnetbaron.com. Well anyways, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more Warhammer 40k content. And again, check me out on Patreon if you'd like to help support the channel even further. Thanks for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one. Happy wargaming.